We're going to begin this chapter by talking about one of the fundamental problems with adding secondary controllers on top of blend shapes. So here I have a simple NURBS plane with a single blend shape. So what we'd like to do, if this were a character for instance, we'd like to have a control, like a cluster, riding along with the blend shape so that we can go in and allow the animator to tweak the shapes that we've modeled for them. But you'll see that doing this in a standard way, where we create a cluster and then assign that cluster either by replacing the handle or by parenting the cluster to an object that is attached to the surface, we introduce a cycle error. And what we mean by a cycle error is that the position of the cluster will depend on the position of the mesh surface that it's attached to, but then when you move the cluster, that will also determine the position of the mesh surface, which in turn is determining the position of the cluster. So it's creating a cycle where they're both dependent on each other. And Maya does not like that and will complain and not behave at all as expected. So basically it's not a usable solution. But I'll demonstrate what I mean by that, and so to become more clear, and then in later lessons in this chapter we'll investigate ways around that problem. So once again, we have a simple NURBS plane, no skinning, just a single blend shape, and there's our blend shape target. So I'm going to select a few vertices. Say I'll select these here. I'm going to create a cluster. So with those vertices selected, deform, create cluster. Okay, so there's our cluster. So I'm going to, let's open up our script editor here. So I'll dial in the blend shape. So you can see it's leaving the cluster handle behind. So if I change the orientation of this surface and then select the cluster, it behaves as we would expect, but if this character is several hundreds of units off in space, this cluster will remain at the point that it was created at, and we'd like these controls to follow along. So this is behaving, not quite intuitively, but it's not what we want. We want our controls to ride along with the character. So we can try editing the deformation order. So I'm going to move the cluster before the blend shape. Change our blend shape. Still, our cluster is not following along with the surface. And now we're not getting any deformation. So let's back up. Change our deformation order back to the original. Put the blend shape before the cluster. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create an object that will ride along with the surface. And I'm just going to use a simple rivet. So I'm going to select two edges. So you can see I have these two edges selected. And I'm going to click on my rivet script button. And there I have a locator. I'll activate the blend shape, and we can see that this locator rides along with the surface. Zoom in a little closer so we can see this. Okay, so far so good. So I'm going to parent this cluster directly to this locator. If I select the cluster first, the locator second, I'm hitting the P key to parent. You can see we get this error, a cycle on the cluster output geometry. And there's our cycle check error. So if I select this cluster, manipulate it, it works fine, but you can see we continually get this cycle check error. Let's see if we're at least getting the behavior that we want. I'm going to activate the blend shape, getting our cycle check errors. Grab our cluster. Okay, so that's not quite behaving the way we want. We'd expect this mesh to move in the same direction as the cluster. Let's try changing this cluster from relative to non-relative. So we get the deformation that we want, the direction. We're still getting our cycle check errors. But if we turn our blends off, you can see that we're getting something of a double transformation. You can see here's our locator. We're doubling up on the cluster deformations. Let's try changing the deformation order again. So I'm going to reorder this cluster below the blend shape so that it triggers before it. So now we're leaving everything, the cluster and the rivet, back in space. So that obviously doesn't work. Okay, let's put our cluster, change the deformation order so our blend shape triggers before our cluster. Okay, so we obviously cannot simply parent the cluster to this locator. Let's try point constraining it. First I'm going to change the pivot so it's right on top of the locator. Hitting the insert key or the home key on your Macintosh, activating point snap and snapping that right on top of the locator. So now I can point constrain them. So I'll select the rivet locator, just select the cluster handle, and then select constrain point, getting our cycle check error again. But also, of course, we've locked the translates on our cluster. So we don't want to do that. So let's undo this. Well, how about using a locator, which is a child of this rivet script, or point and orient constraint to this rivet script, and then using that secondary locator as a handle for this locator, for this cluster. So let's create a locator. I'm going to quickly hide the visibility on this one. I'm going to first parent this new locator to the rivet locator, zero out the translates and rotates, pops in place, and then use this new locator as the new handle for this cluster. We'll select the cluster, open the attribute editor, click on the handle shape tab, open up the weighted node pane, and replace the handle with the locator 1. Okay, once again, we're instantly getting the cycle check error. Let's see if we're at least getting the deformations that we want. Once again, we're getting the double transformations. Okay, so let's back up. I'm going to unparent this locator and point and orient constrain it to the rivet locator. So constrain point, constrain orient. Okay, so now let's parent our cluster to this new locator. Okay, we're getting that error again. Let's see if we're at least getting the deformations we want. Okay, so double transformations. Select this cluster here and change it back to relative. Okay, so there it's popping back into place. Once again, we're not getting the deformations we want. We expect this surface to travel at the same angle as the cluster, which is getting the normal information from the rivet, but it's not. You can try changing the deformation order, ordering the cluster so it triggers before the blend shape, but now neither our rivet nor our cluster follow along with the blend shape. Let's switch this back. Okay, so let's back up. So the last thing we're going to try is using this locator as a handle for the cluster, which I'm sure you're guessing is not going to work. Once again, this is just showing what the problem is. You'd hope something like that would be quite simple, but and there are ways of doing it, but it does require a workaround. Okay, once again, we're immediately getting the cycle check errors. And also, because this is point and orient constrained to the rivet, we can't move it. So here we've tried a few different options for creating a control that follows along with the blend shape, and we're unable to come up with any just off the bat. You either get into cycle check errors or double transformations or no transformations whatsoever, but hopefully that illustrates what the problem is. Basically, the position and orientation of this locator is dependent on the surface. We also want this repositioned cluster to deform this already deformed surface as well. So they're both relying on each other, and that creates what's called a deformation cycle. And Maya will give you errors, and as we can see here, behave in unwanted and often unpredictable ways. So hopefully that's a fairly concise description of what the problem is, illustrating cyclical deformations. And now we'll investigate some methods of getting around this problem.